Welcome, everyone, to the ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Program Committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We're based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, USA. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarx.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. You can also view past presentations, send us a message using our contact form, and make a donation to support our programs on our website, icssmarx.org. Our speaker today is Charlotte Cates, and our session is on the Palestinian, Arab, regional, and international context of the current situation facing the Palestinian people's national liberation struggle. There have been a lot of developments recently in Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, Syria, a lot going on. We're looking forward to Charlotte's presentation and our discussion today. Charlotte is the co-founder of the Semadoun Palestinian Support Solidarity Network. She is a prominent longtime organizer in support of Palestinian liberation, who, because of this, has come under ruthless attack by the Zionists and the Canadian government. Charlotte spoke at our Sunday morning session about repression directed against her last October. So welcome back, Charlotte, to Sunday Morning Marxist Forum.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's always an honor to join all of you for this very important series of events that take place every Sunday, because the work that you're doing is actually very critical in continuing to sustain and expand the intellectual framework of revolutionary work in the United States and internationally. And that's a very important contribution that this forum continues to make on an ongoing basis. So it's really always an honor to join you and to be part of the discussion that takes place here. So when obviously I think all of us have heard a great deal in the past 16 months, certainly, of ongoing genocide targeting the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, but also in the past several weeks, particularly with the development of the ceasefire in Gaza, as well as the, of course, infamous recent Trump-Netanyahu meeting and the threats issued against the Palestinian people and really the entire region from that meeting which took place. But in this context, I think it is also important, and I'll discuss throughout this presentation, the recognition that these threats by Trump and Netanyahu are coming not from a position of absolute power and dictation of the next steps for Palestine and the next steps for the region, but are actually coming from a context in which imperialism and Zionism have failed to achieve their goals in Gaza, have failed to achieve their goals in Palestine, and are seeking to regain the initiative from the successful Palestinian people and their victorious resistance despite the horrors of genocide, that they will continue to fail to do so despite their threats and despite their attacks, but that we also have a role to play as internationalists committed to struggle, as internationalists committed to a vision of a just future in resisting these attacks and resisting these attempts to undermine the Palestinian people, their resistance, and all of the forces of resistance in the region, which are the forces defending humanity on the front lines against Zionism and imperialism, the greatest threat to the world today. So when we speak about the meaning of the ceasefire in Gaza and Gaza at the center of the resistance, I think it is important that we start with the premise that Al-Aqsa flood, what we could also refer to as the 7th of October 2023, changed the world. And that this is something that was undertaken quite deliberately by the Palestinian resistance. Of course, nobody could have predicted the absolute inhumanity of the genocide and the absolute unwillingness of all imperialist forces, even in order to seemingly preserve their own interests and their own futures, to in any way stop or limit the genocide. But it was very clear when the Palestinian resistance undertook this effort that this was a conscious, knowing, and committed effort to undo the process of liquidation that had been targeting the Palestinian cause, particularly amid the so-called Abraham Accords, the so-called deal of the century, and the rush to normalization between the Zionist regime and Saudi Arabia. In a recent documentary that was released on Al Jazeera Arabic, Mohammed Deif, the martyr Mohammed Deif, who was the commander of the Al Qassam brigades and really the across the board kind of military leader of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian revolutionary movement, said very clearly that, we are going to be changing the world with this action. And that footage might not have been available until after the ceasefire had already happened. But that was quite apparent in the decisions, the choices, and the willingness of the Palestinian resistance to commit to taking part in a coordinated, planned, and really quite brilliantly engineered military action to confront the Zionist regime, to confront its military bases, to confront its settlements surrounding Gaza, and to put an end to the status quo of ongoing death, silencing, and destruction targeting the Palestinian people. And there have been many, many lies, mistruths, and misrepresentations of Al-Aqsa flood, of October 7th itself, of the behavior of Palestinian revolutionaries and fighters, and of the conduct of the Zionist military against its own population during the 7th of October. There has been a concerted attempt to smear the reputations of Palestinian fighters. There's been a concerted attempt to create an image of horror and hatred around the 7th of October of 2023 and around Al-Aqsa flood, because of the very same reason why this was such a momentous occasion for the Palestinian people and really for the global anti-imperialist movement. And that's because on the 7th of October, 2023, the Palestinian resistance showed that it had the capabilities in terms of planning, in terms of logistics, in terms of military strength, in terms of organizing, in terms of all aspects of the struggle to actually defeat the Zionist entity, that its so-called impenetrability and superiority were not in fact a superiority and an impenetrability, that part of bringing down that power was actually to take into the revolutionaries' hands the ability to bring down the Zionist regime and to challenge it at a very central level and at a military level. And so because the fact that the Zionist entity was caught unaware, their military were unable to fight in direct hand-to-hand combat with Palestinian fighters. This is why the strikes that were carried out by the Zionist regime on that day involved bringing helicopters into the sky to shoot basically at anything that was moving along the colonially imposed borders of Gaza, because of the fact that the Zionist regime was incapable of engaging in that level of combat, in that level of fighting, was unable to defeat the Palestinian resistance at that level. So what we also saw at the same time was that just as much as the Zionists were unable to deal with the Palestinian fighters on the 7th of October during Al-Aqsa flood, this was recognized globally as a crisis for imperialism, particularly for US imperialism, but also for all of its partners in crime, Britain, France, Germany, Canada, etc. And this is why we saw a parade of imperialist leaders flying to Tel Aviv in the coming days. We saw these immediate declarations of unlimited support, and we saw very high levels of domestic repression targeting the movement in support of the Palestinian cause in all of these countries. Because just as much as the Palestinian people could see Al-Aqsa flood as a harbinger of a future in which it was possible for the Palestinian resistance to bring a defeat to Zionism, that it would also be clear that this was the harbinger of a future in which the forces of resistance in the region, not only in Palestine, but in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Iran, and also in Syria, but we'll talk more about that complicated equation later, could bring an end to US imperialism in the region as well, and could bring an end to the history of colonial domination of the entire Arab nation and the entire broader Arab and Iranian region. And so this was something that they sought to stop by all means. And so this is the history of the escalated genocide that we have witnessed for the past 16 months, particularly targeting the Palestinian people in Gaza, in which well over 50,000 Palestinians' lives were taken, in which there are many, many thousands more bodies still buried under the rubble, in which there are hundreds of thousands who have been displaced, who have been injured, children who have been made orphans. There has been a complete destruction at a physical level of universities, of hospitals and the healthcare system, of municipality buildings and land records, and the records that make up the everyday life of the Palestinian people, of the historic buildings of mosques and churches, and histories of Palestinian existence and life that persisted for well over 1,000 years, indeed for thousands of years. There's, a mosque that was 1,000 years old that was bombed and turned into rubble by the Zionist regime in this genocidal assault over the past 16 months. And what we've seen consistently throughout that time from the United States and its allies has been not just an unwillingness to stop the Zionist regime, but in fact, the direct involvement of the United States in planning, organizing the attacks, providing the weaponry, providing the advice, and providing the intelligence for those attacks to continue, not only inside Palestine, but in Lebanon as well, where the Zionist regime during its war on Lebanon, which is continuing at this moment despite the ceasefire, because we are continuing to see Zionist forces occupying and invading villages in the south of Lebanon and firing upon residents in the Lebanese army when they are supposed to be leaving, and they were supposed to have left weeks ago. That we witnessed these, the assassination attacks, for example, against Syed Hassan Nasrallah, against Hashem Safiuddin, against many of the leaders of Hezbollah and of the Lebanese resistance. These were attacks that were enabled, funded, and indeed directed by the United States and not by the Zionist regime alone. So when we've witnessed this ceasefire, the question becomes, why has there been a ceasefire now? Why was there a ceasefire put into place one day before the presidential inauguration in the United States? And of course, that date is not accidental. Now, of course, this is not, as we all know, indicate some kind of unfriendliness to Zionism or anti-imperialism on the part of the Trump administration. Any illusions about that should be cast aside, certainly after the past week and, of course, the infamous Trump-Netanyahu meeting and its proclamation and the proclamations that resulted from it. But it is a recognition of the fact that this genocide has been, first of all, fully bipartisan. It has been, like all matters of imperialism, not simply a battle over foreign policy between Democrats and Republicans, but seen as a fundamental interest of US imperialism, with the parties battling each other to describe who will be even more of an of a supplier of weaponry and a genocidal supporter of the Zionist regime, and who will take even more repressive actions against those who resist it. But at the same time, it was also very clear that this was a recognition of the reality that the genocide is viewed within the United States, even within the heart of the imperial core, at a popular level, as being a stain on the United States. As it doesn't matter even if people don't necessarily share this analysis of imperialism, if they simply think that the Zionist lobby has too much power, if they simply think that this is the kind of crime that shouldn't be happening and that's it. On a very human level, people do not want to be associated with the destruction of Gaza, with the killing of children, with the slaughter of families, with the mass destruction of hospitals. And so the end of the overt level of genocide in Gaza is actually essential to sort of any kind of US political effort, even to simply put a new face on a new era, because the genocide has been kind of indelibly branded as Biden's genocide, just at the same time as Trump is seeking to brand the expulsion and repression of the Palestinian people and the ongoing Nakba as a Trump project as well. But at the same time, the other reason why we saw a ceasefire in that developed in January, and of course it's important to remember that this is a fragile ceasefire. It is not one that is permanent. It is not one that is secure. It continues to be fragile. The other reason that we saw this happen in January is because of the striking and stunning counteroffensive of the Palestinian resistance, particularly in the north of Gaza. The videos and reports released by the Al-Qassam Brigade, Suraya al-Quds, and the other resistance forces in the north of Gaza showed that despite the horrific levels of bombing and genocidal assault on the Palestinian people, particularly in North Gaza, where hundreds of thousands and then tens of thousands of Palestinians, not Palestinian fighters, but Palestinian civilians, held out until the last moment under rubble without any kind of access to food and water in the most incredible of conditions, because they were unwilling to leave their homes and they were unwilling to leave their land. And because, of course, it is important to remember here that 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are themselves refugees from occupied Palestine 1948 and their descendants. They are Palestinians who have been displaced from their homes and lands since 1948, who have been denied their right to return home. And so this resulted in the absolute unwillingness of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Palestinians in North Gaza to leave their homes, even in the most unlivable and inhumane conditions imaginable. And at the same time, Palestinian resistance fighters continued to carry out operation after operation against occupying forces in the north of Gaza. Day after day after day, there were report after report after report of a serious security incident, of a damaging security incident, of security incidents subjected to censorship, in which dead and wounded Zionist soldiers were being ferried back for treatment and burial that was happening in the north of Gaza. So this is the context. This is the rest of the context in which the ceasefire happened. So the ceasefire and its first stage development revealed really two things at the same time. One is the simple fact that if at any time the United States government had found it convenient for this genocidal aggression to come to an end at any point in the past 16 months, it would have done so at that moment, because the entity in this relationship between Zionism and imperialism that calls the shots is fundamentally that of the United States, the funder, the backer, the founder, and not the project which carries out its goals in the region, the largest aircraft carrier, as it has been said. But secondly, also, that far from the predictions that a day after in Gaza would mean an end to the development of the Palestinian resistance, mere humanitarian aid rather than the continuation of Gaza as a center of resistance in the region, that this resistance was able to deal blow after blow after blow to the Zionist war machine. And so in this context, and especially in the context of what's been taking place recently in terms of Trump's threats against Palestinians and Trump and Netanyahu's kind of war threats against Iran and the region, that we must be wary of analyses that position the United States and the Zionist entity as undefeatable regimes that simply by declaring things can ensure that their attacks are successful. On the contrary, what we have seen over the past 16 months is that it is the Palestinian people who are undefeatable, despite the level of technological development and military weaponry in the hands of their enemies. And of course, just today, as we're having this meeting, as we're having this discussion, the Zionist forces withdrew from the Netzarim axis, the so-called Netzarim axis, where they had been attempting to separate the north and south of Gaza. And this is an area that they were never able to hold securely during the entire genocidal assault against the Palestinian people, because it was constantly under fire by the resistance forces. And so when we look at Gaza today, what we are seeing are people who are continuing to suffer under the most extreme of circumstances. And we see a Zionist regime that continues to violate the ceasefire at every possible opportunity, including the blocking of the entry of tents, the blocking of the entry of mobile homes, the blocking of entry of heavy construction equipment for the removal of rubble. There have only been approximately 8,000 trucks that have entered, while there should have been 12,000 trucks that have entered. And this is just a small, and in addition, there have been far fewer supplies to northern Gaza than were supposed to be allotted under the ceasefire. And of course, this is not surprising, because historically, the Zionist regime has always violated every ceasefire with the Palestinian people and with the Palestinian resistance that has ever been signed with it, at any point in the past 76 years. But what we still see today in this situation where people are struggling to live and struggling to survive, we see the turning on of the electricity and the municipal lighting in the refugee camps in Gaza. We see the reconstruction so far of around 50% of Gaza's sewer system. We see the redeployment of the police and security forces. We see the bringing to an end of price gouging and of the exploitation of poverty, which had been taking place in Gaza. We see the tremendous level of effort and work exerted by really two sectors of society. And there, in many cases, really, we're talking about one class of society, which is the Palestinian resistance and the fighters that make it up, and the working class of the municipalities and of the region, who have been ensuring the development and the continuing work of society after they specifically were targeted. This includes, of course, healthcare workers, this includes food workers, this includes agricultural workers, and of course, this includes the municipal workers that have been working around the clock to restore every service possible, despite the most unimaginable conditions that continue to exist within Gaza. And so when we look at Gaza today, what we see are images of horror, of suffering, of really conditions in which no human should be forced to live. But what we also see are images of steadfastness, of strength, and indeed of victory. Because when there was an entire discussion throughout the past 16 months about what the day after the war will look like, it was almost as if in every one of these discussions, at least those that took place in mainstream media, in imperialist sources in the West, that this would be a future without the Palestinian resistance. And on the contrary, what we've seen is that the Palestinian resistance is just as strong as it has ever been, despite all of the horrors that have been inflicted upon themselves and upon their people. So when we talk about Gaza today, we're still speaking about the center of the axis of resistance and the global front of resistance, of which our international movements are a part as well. And perhaps this is no more clearly illustrated anywhere than through the prisoner exchanges, what is being called Tufan al-Ahrar, the flood of the free, just like Tufan al-Aqsa flood. And this is the flood of the free. This is the name being given to the prisoner exchanges being carried out as part of the ceasefire agreement. And of course, I'm focusing on Gaza, but Palestine is not limited to Gaza. Palestine is Palestine from the river to the sea. And while we are speaking about a ceasefire in Gaza, which is not fully a ceasefire for all of the reasons that we've discussed, including the fact that occupation soldiers continue to snipe at people from the border, from the so-called borders of Gaza, in the West Bank, we're seeing an all-out attack on the refugee camps in Tulkarm, in Tubas, in Jenin. And this is an ongoing assault on the Palestinian people and an effort to continue to steal Palestinian land in the West Bank as well. The battle in Palestine is one battle with multiple fronts inside Palestine. And so it's always important to remember that Gaza is part of Palestine, but Gaza is not all of Palestine. So in the prisoner exchange, and of course, this is very apparent in the prisoner exchanges as well, because the prisoners, the Palestinian prisoners who are being released by the resistance come from all areas of Palestine. They are from the West Bank, they're from Jerusalem, they're from Gaza, and some of them are from occupied Palestine 48, even though that is one of the major battles of the resistance in the prisoner exchange, because the Zionist regime continues to refuse to exchange Palestinians from 1948 occupied Palestine, that is Palestinians who have been born with so-called Israeli citizenship that have had it imposed upon them because their families were able to remain following the Nakba. That they refused to release them in an exchange with the Palestinian resistance, saying that this is an internal Israeli matter. And so when we've seen several Palestinians from 1948 Palestine released by the resistance as part of this exchange, every single time someone is released in one of those categories, this has been a hard-fought victory for the resistance, and it's an ongoing battle that continues to take place. These prisoner exchanges, Tufan al-Ahrar, have revealed many things in front of the world. In the first place, they have provided a clear contrast of the ethics of the Palestinian resistance, the ethics of the colonized people who are fighting back against an imperialist colonizing power, versus the ethics of the colonizer and the ethics of the imperialist. And so what we have seen is that every single one of the releases of Zionist prisoners who have been held by the resistance has been carried out in a very public way, on a very public stage, with the presence of a full complement of Al-Qassam Brigade, certainly, but also of Saraya al-Quds, also of the Mujahideen movement, also of the Nasser Salahuddin brigades, depending on who were holding the Zionist captives. They have participated in various ways in the exchanges. In many cases, and these exchanges that are carried out by the Palestinian resistance are full of very obvious symbolic meaning that is very consciously being used to carry a message that is carried more strongly through action rather than simply through rhetoric. And this is to demonstrate the military strength of the Palestinian resistance that has been undefeated. This is to demonstrate the increase in ranks of the military ranks of the resistance, showing that if the Zionists begin to start the genocidal assault again tomorrow, they will be met by even greater resistance, by even greater military force and strength, and to show, also really to expose just that point, that after all of the statements by every imperialist official in the world about the hostages and how they need to come home, with no regard whatsoever to the over 10,000 Palestinians imprisoned by the Zionist regime, some for years and years and years and years and years, some for decades at a time, many without charge or trial under so-called administrative detention, that what we have witnessed time and time again is that those who were killed because they were bombed by the Zionist army itself, and those that were kept alive at the hands of the resistance. and they were kept alive, they were treated well. In many cases, they ate better and lived better than the fighters, and they ate better and they lived better than the Palestinian people in Gaza. And they received a greater level of protection because of the fact that they were captives, they were prisoners of war. So there was both the level of ethical commitment made by the Palestinian resistance in their treatment, but also a commitment to the Palestinian people and to their prisoners, that all of this sacrifice that Palestinians were going through in order to win their freedom, in order to win the freedom of the thousands of Palestinians locked behind bars of the Zionist regime, was not going to be for naught. They were going to achieve the exchange. And the exchange, together with a ceasefire, together with an end to the siege, together with comprehensive reconstruction, has been and always been very clearly a major goal and a major outcome of Al-Aqsa flood and of the October 7th operation. Most recently, there was an exchange which took place yesterday, in which the stage on which the Al-Qassam brigades exchanged the three Zionist captives, detainees that were held by them, said, "We are the flood, we are the next day." And this slogan was a very clear answer to all of the discussion about what will happen the next day in Gaza and the various proposals for all kinds of foreign and occupation administrations to rule Gaza without the consent of the Palestinian people. These images of the prisoner releases carried out by the Palestinian resistance are images of victory for Palestine, and they are images of defeat for Zionism and imperialism. They have created a level of outrage again among the Zionist regime that would seem almost impossible, especially given the fact that what these exchanges tend to reveal is that the so-called hostages, the prisoners held by the resistance, were treated well, they were kept safe. They were kept safe from the Zionist regime's own bombing by the Palestinian resistance. And, rather than celebrate their return home, the Zionist regime and its media have essentially gone into a flurry of outrage with every single exchange. And that is simply because these exchanges show several things. One is that they were completely unable to, quote unquote, defeat Hamas. This is a pipe dream that was shown as something that they did not achieve in any way, despite all of the level of destruction. And that these prisoners are not being released because they were coerced or released by the Zionist assault. These prisoners are being released by the decision of the resistance. And this is something that has been made clear time and time again in all of the messaging and the statements and the public pronouncements of the Palestinian resistance about the releases, that these are taking place by the decision of the resistance. In other words, the decision to fight, the decision to release rests in the hands of the resistance. And despite all of the attacks and despite all of the destruction, they have been unable to shatter this even a little bit over the past 16 months. Now, on the other hand, we take a look at the releases of Palestinian prisoners, which have taken place, of course, in far greater number. There have already been well over 700 Palestinian prisoners released as part of the ongoing exchanges. These have included over 200 serving who have served over 20 years in Zionist prisons, many with life sentences, many with long sentences, and also 222 Palestinian prisoners who are Palestinians from Gaza who were abducted after the 7th of October in many various places throughout Gaza and held in some of the most notorious torture camps to be created by the Zionist regime, places like Sede Timan, places where Palestinians were basically forced to stand 24/7, stripped naked, shackled, sexually assaulted, beaten, starved, mistreated and abused at all levels. And what we've seen time and time again with these releases of Palestinian prisoners has been the sheer level of violence and physical abuse and starvation that they have been subjected to. Certainly the Zionist captives that were released yesterday by by the Palestinian resistance, for example, certainly were much thinner than when they were captured. But they were simply sharing the fate and the circumstances of the Palestinian people in Gaza, that when you are being held in northern Gaza and there is no food, every person there is kind of sharing in the same circumstances. And so they were sharing in the circumstances of the Palestinian people who they were being held with. On the other hand, inside occupied Palestine 1948, where there is a full Western imperialist level of access to food, the Palestinian prisoners have been subjected to a deliberate campaign of starvation. And just like, frankly, the Zionist prisoners in Gaza were also subjected to the Zionist campaign of deliberate and forced starvation imposed upon Palestinians in Gaza across the board. What we have seen are multiple people whose hair and beards have gone completely white due to a lack of nutrition, due to starvation. Yesterday, the Palestinian prisoners were being beaten in front of the Red Cross representatives as they were turned over. 7 Palestinians that were released had to be taken to hospital immediately because their bodies were so battered and beaten by the Zionist soldiers immediately upon their release. And what we have also seen are the absolute forbidding of celebrations, arrests targeting Palestinian families. And there have been multiple cases of Zionist soldiers being filmed going into Palestinian families' homes in the morning that their loved ones are going to be released after 20 years in occupation prisons, and breaking all the chairs in the house so that they can't host an indoor reception to welcome their loved ones. If there are comments or questions, I will get to them in the rather than responding now as I'm speaking. There are multiple images of men who were in prison as well, especially the group of prisoners that were released on February 1st, that the physical effects of their imprisonment was very clear and obvious on their bodies. Most of these were men who had been held prisoner for over 20 years. And it's worth it to note that these Palestinian prisoners who are being released by the resistance come from all factions and trends of the Palestinian struggle. So there are many from Fatah, many from Hamas, there are many from Islamic Jihad, some from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, some from the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and of course some who are unaffiliated, particularly the random people from Gaza who were abducted, and Palestinian youth who are 16, 17, and 18 years old who were abducted by the Zionist regime. So this attempt to forbid celebration, there have been multiple arrests of family members. In several cases, Zionist soldiers have stormed the homes of those who were just freed like 3 to 4 times in one night. And yet one of the things that continues to persist in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, is that no matter what, Palestinians are going to celebrate their prisoners. They're going to celebrate their release. And so what we see, this behavior and the forbidding of celebrations and the, systematic starvation of imprisoned people and the breaking of chairs in the homes of the prisoners, this is not an image of victory. This is not an image of unlimited power on the part of the Zionist regime, despite it being backed up by trillions of dollars of US military might. This is an image of defeat. This is an image of a defeated entity that is unable to secure its vision for the future. And so this is the context in which we saw Trump and Netanyahu hold, of course, their infamous press conference in which Trump threatened the Palestinian people in Gaza with continued ethnic cleansing and dispossession, specifically to Egypt and Jordan. This is the context in which the Trump-Netanyahu meeting occurred. In fact, it occurred almost immediately after the February 1st prisoner exchange, in which many of these images, the images of Qassam brigades releasing the Zionist prisoners were held in such sharp contrast to the conditions under which Palestinian prisoners released by the resistance as part of Tufan al-Ahrar were being exchanged. These images have had a powerful effect around the world, and they've had a powerful effect inside the Zionist entity itself. They've created a crisis. They've created a reckoning with the reality that 16 months of genocide have, just like 76 years of ongoing genocide, have done nothing to quell the Palestinian will for liberation, for a future of freedom and justice, for continuing to remain on one's land, and for determining one's own future, that they've done nothing to achieve that. In fact, this entire genocide has taken tens of thousands of precious lives. It has destroyed years of knowledge and learning. It has destroyed institutions of education and health and learning and prayer and worship and community interaction. But it has done nothing to destroy the Palestinian will to survive and to determine a free future, and of course to resist to achieve those goals. So it is, and of course these statements also come as the resistance, the Zionist regime, the United States, Qatar, and Egypt prepare to enter the second round of indirect negotiations for the second round of the ceasefire in Doha. So when we look at Trump's proclamation, we should be very clear that this is a dangerous, unacceptable political game. But it is also a political game that is being played by the imperialist powers. It is a political game that is being played by those who have no regard for the lives and the futures and the existence of the Palestinian people. But it is the same kind of shock and awe proclamations that we've even seen the Trump administration using in inter-imperialist conflicts, for example, threatening to make Canada the 51st state, or saying that they want to take Greenland from Denmark. It is not too distinct from this situation, except of course for the extreme disregard for Palestinian life, and that is not something to be taken lightly. Palestinians have made quite clear over the past 16 months of absolutely carpet bombing and fire belting of their homes, refugee camps, towns, and villages, that they are not going anywhere. And so any discussion of Palestinians being forced to go to Egypt or Jordan raises the question of who exactly is expecting to do that forcing. And so then that becomes, that becomes a threat to essentially, yes, they've been trying it. That's what the past 16 months were. The last 16 months were an attempt to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people and to force them from their land. And they refused to do so. And their refusal to do so and their steadfastness throughout Gaza is the number one factor that brought about the ceasefire that we have today. And so there's no reason to expect a different outcome because it's Trump making the threats rather than Biden next to Netanyahu. It's still the same series of threats against the Palestinian people. This is not a change in the situation, but what it is an attempt to do is to regain the initiative from the Palestinian resistance, which was quite clearly the holder of the initiative in this situation following the ceasefire and as the prisoner exchanges have been ongoing. This was an attempt to create an image of strength, an image of shock and awe to rival that of the Palestinian resistance in its images and their effect upon the Zionist public in terms of the strength of Netanyahu's government, for example. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't take it seriously, and this doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight back against it. Of course, we should fight back against it. And the ways that we can fight back against it are really the same ways in which we can fight back. We could have fought back against the genocidal regime under Biden, and the ways in which we fight back against imperialism and Zionism across the board. Trump hasn't altered the situation. What he has done is just continued the intense an ongoing imperialist assault upon the Palestinian people and upon really all of the people of the region. This is not a new assault. It's a continuation of the same policies that have characterized what the United States means. There's a reason why George Habash and really Palestinian revolutionary after Palestinian revolutionary have declared that the United States is the head of the snake. And that was over 50 years ago. And that's because we're looking at the same policies, the same attacks, the same ongoing assault against the Palestinian people and their very existence in occupied Palestine. And what we've seen in the past month is that the Palestinian resistance holds the initiative to bring that to a stop as much as is possible, given the global balance of power that exists. That we are moving towards a multipolar world, and we are moving towards a pluripolar world, but we are maybe not yet fully there. And so what we're seeing is this is not coming from a position of strength. This is coming from a position of, in some ways, desperation, despite all of the military technology that we have. Now, of course, what we know is that a desperate and wounded beast is a dangerous one. And so that's why it's very important that we don't ignore or just casually dismiss these kinds of threats. But we also must be very clear that we are not talking about a Trump plan. We are not talking about a Trump proposal. We are also not talking about something that has already happened and is a fait accompli, and that now we just simply have to engage in the postmortems. We are talking about a series of threats being issued from the White House, and a series of threats really not just against the Palestinian people, but against all of the people of the world. And so these threats are being issued, of course, first and foremost against the Palestinian people, but also at the same meeting, for example, against Iran. And they're also being issued, frankly, against the reactionary Arab regimes that have been consistently doing the bidding of US imperialism in the region. So this isn't just an attack on the Palestinian people. It's also a threat against Egypt. It's also a threat against Jordan. Quite frankly, there could be the destabilization of the relationship between the United States, Egypt, and Jordan is something which will only harm US imperialism in the region and can only be beneficial in the long run to all of the liberation movements. I mean, Jordan was shooting down drones that were going to target the Zionist regime from Iraq and from Iran during Al-Aqsa flood. Jordan was operating a land bridge to bring goods and supplies to the Zionist regime, while Yemen was shutting down the supply lines of genocide in the Red Sea. So Egypt was keeping the Rafah crossing closed, including closed to the entry of humanitarian workers, healthcare workers, food, aid, and supplies, not just keeping closed to the exit of Palestinians who were being ethnically cleansed, but also to the entry of the kinds of supplies that would have brought this genocide to an end much more quickly. By destabilizing the relationship and issuing threats against Egypt and Jordan, the US has the potential to be creating a crisis at a whole different level, which will only rebound upon itself. And this is particularly true in the context of regional politics in the axis of resistance. And of course, this has been a challenging time for the axis of resistance. I'm speaking to you tonight from Beirut. And here in Lebanon, there continues to be an ongoing struggle to force the Zionist regime to leave the south of Lebanon when it was supposed to do so by the 26th of January. It was unable to hold those positions during the war with the Lebanese resistance because Hezbollah fighters had engaged them everywhere. They were unable to take a town or hold a village. And they've been only able to keep these soldiers in place because there is a ceasefire that was supposed to end, that was supposed to go fully into effect at the end of January, as the Lebanese army claimed those positions in the south of Lebanon. But at the same day that we saw 500,000 Palestinians insisting on returning to their homes in northern Gaza was also the same day in which we saw Lebanese people returning to the south of Lebanon and essentially securing the re-liberation of their villages time and again. And we're seeing that same process continuing today. The attacks on the Lebanese resistance were very severe. The assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the assassination of Hisham Safiuddin, the assassination of many of the high and middle ranks of Hezbollah's leadership are losses that will be felt not only by the Lebanese people, but by the entire Arab resistance front, the entire regional resistance front, and really by the global resistance. And the same is also true of the targeting of Palestinian leadership who played a historic role in this struggle, from Ismail Haniyeh to Saleh Rouri to, of course, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. But at the same time, once again, the Lebanese resistance and Hezbollah did show that the Zionist regime would never succeed in conquering Lebanon. And it's becoming more and more clear the level of threat that the US continues to pose to Lebanese sovereignty. Just several days ago, the new US envoy to Lebanon met with the new president, Joseph Aoun, who was previously the commander of the Lebanese army, and who had been kind of promoted as someone who was a choice or being supported by the United States. And essentially what this US envoy did was engage in a series of threats and clear disrespect to President Aoun and to Lebanon itself, declaring that Israel had done a great job in stopping Hezbollah. And saying this in Lebanon, where people are still displaced from their homes and still living in situations of displacement where their buildings have been destroyed and their homes have been destroyed by Zionist bombing. So it's just showing kind of complete disregard, which has been obvious, of course, throughout every way in which the United States has engaged with Lebanon. But it's also very clearly just showed complete disregard for even those Lebanese politicians that were being seen as in some kind of alliance with the United States. And the US, of course, was demanding to determine who shall be the ministers in Lebanon. And really, they're not achieving their goals in the way in which they sought to. And the Lebanese resistance has not been destroyed. It continues to be strong. There are youthful ranks in Hezbollah which have continued to fill its ranks, and both Hezbollah and Hamas have been fully able to fill all of their leadership positions. These are not organizations with a thin level of leadership. These are organizations that are very deeply rooted in their peoples. These are very deeply rooted in their communities. These are organizations that are resistance fighters, but they are the people. They are made up of the people. They come from the people. And so these kinds of assassination attacks can be very serious. They take something away that is very important. Our leadership isn't something to be taken lightly. But at the same time, they've not been able to bring an end to the resistance, not in Palestine and not in Lebanon, through their attacks. Of course, the situation in Syria, on the other hand, is much more complex, and I don't have the same kind of positive news to report there. As, of course, we all know, not only did the Syrian government fall by Turkish-backed forces that comprised Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and are now running the Syrian government with Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, now known as Ahmed al-Shara, naming himself the president of Syria for the next 4 years. These I don't have the same positive things to report in the situation in Syria. What we saw was an immediate Zionist onslaught against Syria, against the nation and people of Syria, which involved the destruction of multiple military sites and the seizing of an escalated level of Syrian territory at the same time that the Zionist regime has been occupying the Syrian Golan Heights since 1967. And so they've been continuing to seize land, to seize territory, to set up military bases in Syria. And this is really a threat to the Syrian people as a whole and to everyone in the region. And this is something that is going to have to be defeated for any Syrian project to actually seek a future for this country that is based in self-determination and developing a future for the Syrian people. It's interesting to note in this context that at the same time that Western leaders and imperialist leaders have been loudly proclaiming their support for so-called free Syria, despite the fact that there have been multiple well-documented instances of ongoing sectarian violence, violence being conducted at the hands of the state against minority communities, violence being directed against political opponents, various kinds of repression, various kinds of attacks, not to mention right now, attacks on the border with Lebanon against Lebanese villages. They haven't actually undone the sanctions on Syria. And the sanctions on Syria played a major role. The sanctions, the coercive economic measures directed against Syria played a major role in the destruction of the Syrian state, which led to this situation, because it was essentially starved of resources, starved of money, starved of the ability to continue the aspects of life that are essential to sustaining a state and being able to sustain a military that can fight back against an enemy and a population that will join in resisting that kind of assault, because that's not what we saw happen in early December in Syria. And for those of us, particularly in the United States, particularly in Canada, particularly in European countries that are responsible for continuing to impose these ongoing sanctions on Syria, is that, like, we need to focus on fighting sanctions. We need to focus on fighting sanctions as part of our anti-imperialist struggle and movement, because sanctions are dangerous to people. We say that sanctions kill, and this is true, but sanctions take lives on a daily basis through denial of access to healthcare, through denial of access to medicine, through denial of access to travel and basic needs, through denial of access to food. But they also kill states, and they kill revolutions, and they kill movements. And so if we want to bring that killing to an end, we have a responsibility to fight back against these sanctions regimes and not just see them as a lesser aspect of war or the status quo or an everyday aspect of life that needs to be accepted, because that is one of the major aspects of how we have gotten to this absolutely devastating situation that exists in Syria today, including an ongoing and expanding Israeli occupation of Syrian land. And right now, these Western powers, while they're busy extolling the self-declaration of Ahmed al-Shara as the new president of Syria, are also continuing to keep the sanctions on, because the sanctions are not just a mechanism of punishment, they're also a mechanism of threat and control. And so the sanctions are just as damaging to any project that has the potential of any kind of independent future for Syria. And they're determined to prevent any kind of independence from reemerging in Syria. And so this is, very much the context in which the ongoing situation in Syria is presenting itself. On the other hand, what we've seen in Yemen is really an inspirational example to the people of the world. What we saw in Yemen was the government in Sana'a was able to take advantage of its unique position in the world and its unique and specific geographic position to specifically shut down the supply lines of genocide and shut down the transit of genocide products through the Red Sea and targeting shipping. And so this was able to impose its own kind of sanctions and coercive economic measures. But this time, rather than advancing genocide, it has the purpose of blocking genocide. And so what we've seen in Yemen is was really a unique position, a strategic position, and something that has positioned Yemen as a country that is able to play a major role in the region, despite its own experiences of siege, of sanctions, and of ongoing, essentially, struggle against this Saudi-backed rump regime that's based in Aden. It's worth noting here that Yemen has developed very serious measures and internal measures to develop its agriculture, to develop its internal production, and to develop its internal economy in order to have a higher level of resistance to sanctions and siege. And that has been one of the main lessons that Yemen has taken away from its own over 10 years of ongoing war and even genocidal war. And of course, what we are also seeing right now is an escalation of threats of war against Iran, an attempt, a declaration after declaration by Trump and Netanyahu that Iran is very weak. Yet at the same time, it's very clear that they continue to fear a military confrontation with Iran and are attempting essentially to engage in the same kind of psychological warfare that they are engaging in against the Palestinian people. But one thing that this has also done, it has helped to strengthen the positions and to make clear the positions of the Iranian leadership on the issue of seeking relationships with the United States, potentially at the expense of the Iranian people and their self-determination. For example, Sayyid Ali Khamenei said yesterday and made very clear that he had no belief in such negotiations with the United States, particularly given the US's history in this regard, as well as its threats against the world that are taking place today. And so we should not expect Iran to be taken out of the framework of resistance because of the threats of Trump and Netanyahu and their partners. Instead, what we are witnessing is a new era of struggle. It's the post-Al-Aqsa flood era of struggle, and it's the post-Al-Aqsa flood era of imperialism. And so that means it must also be a next step for our movement and a post-Al-Aqsa flood era of anti-imperialism, in which we have a responsibility in the imperial core to do everything that we can to build and escalate the international popular cradle of the resistance, to not simply call for ceasefire now, although it is important to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and elsewhere in occupied Palestine, to not simply call for ceasefire now, but to express our clear solidarity with the resistance, to resist the so-called terrorist listings of Palestinian, Lebanese, and Yemeni resistance organizations, to resist the so-called terror listing of the the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and other forces in Iran, to resist the so-called state sponsor of terrorism designations against Cuba, Iran, and other countries, and to develop our level of resistance, because we can't simply stand aside and denounce, just like we couldn't stand aside and simply denounce Biden and his trillions of dollars, and his $22 billion in weaponry to the Zionist regime. We also can't simply stand aside and denounce Trump and his threats against the Palestinian people in Gaza. This is a time when we have to dedicate ourselves to organizing. This is a time when we have to dedicate ourselves to mobilization. We are going to be facing an ongoing intense level of repression at the hands of the state. This is a level of repression that is fairly likely to be escalated by many of Trump's appointees. For example, the new Attorney General announcing an October 7th task force to look into those who are pro-Hamas. But the only way that this kind of repression is built on the same kind of repression that's been taking place for the past 16 months. There have been hundreds of people who have been kicked out of school, who have lost their jobs, who are facing various kinds of arrests and criminal prosecutions and jail time. This is just across the United States. Let's leave aside the attacks on journalist homes in Britain. Let's leave aside the thousands of people who have been arrested in Germany for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Where like in Germany, for example, the banning of Samadun took place in November of 2023. Well, now they've reached the point where the German state government is banning local Palestine solidarity organizations in communities across the country because this method of banning, repression, and prosecution is seen as the only way. The genocide itself is indefensible, and Zionism is indefensible. So the only defense they have is just outright repression and criminalization. So we have a responsibility to do everything that we can to organize to confront that repression. And the best way that we have to confront that repression is by organizing at a mass level, not to make invisible the subjects of repression or to steer clear of the topics that are most subjected to repression, but to make clear our stand with the resistance, with all of its forces, and to translate that into practical support, including taking action like we see in the UK by Palestine Action to shut down arms factories, and including mass movement actions and mobilizations in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their resistance and all of the forces of resistance in the region. Because just as it has been for the past 16 months, it is the forces of resistance that continue to defend humanity. And so it's up to all of us, not just to view and be outraged, but to take that outrage into our organizing, into our mobilization, into the streets, and into our actions to take on that slogan that the El Qassam brigades put on the stage where they were releasing the Zionist captives, to say, we are the flood, we are the next day. Well, we are all the next day, and this is the only way that we're going to fight back against Trump, Netanyahu, and all of the forces of inhumanity that are attempting to silence the center of resistance in the world and break apart the axis of resistance, is to build something even bigger than an axis of resistance, a global front that cannot be broken.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you.